Back to its roots, the future of identity politics. When contrast classes are compared with one another, many of the disadvantages in contrast to race and gender overlap with economic class. In addition, when the disadvantage of non-economic issues conflict with economic issues, our intuition leans towards the economic disadvantage as the contrast class with more relevance. This was illuminated when comparing the white homeless man with the black wealthy woman. However, just because we should recognize economic class as the most relevant does not suggest that we shouldn't recognize non-economic disadvantage oppression at all. This approach is what can resolve issues raised by Adolf Reed regarding race reductionism, but whilst not appealing to a strict class reductionism. This is because economic class issues are placed at the forefront of social issues to be addressed, whilst acknowledging the legitimacy of other issues concerning identity groups. For instance, we can simultaneously advocate for the increasing of the minimum wage, which would improve the lives of the working class and the lives of identity groups that disproportionately belong to the working class. However, we can also advocate policies such as unconscious bias training for employers and body cameras for police officers, since these are of specific concern to people of colour. A similar approach has been put forward by Albert L. Terry III, 2016, which he calls Marxist identity politics. Terry makes similar observations as I do in this book. He argues that IP is intersectional and that class exists as one of those intersections. He concludes the article with this: what we should bring to light, however, is that it's not just about the intersection between racial, gender, and sexual identity, but between all those and class identity. We need to put forward a new Marxist identity politics that recognizes the special oppression that comes with race and the consequent importance of fighting racism head-on, but also emphasizes that the interests of the bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie of color are just as hostile to working class POC as the interests of the white bourgeoisie are, and the interests of the bourgeoisie women are still hostile to the interests of the working class women. Class and identity are not mutually exclusive. Black and brown workers' struggle is workers' struggle. Working women's struggle is workers' struggle. LGBTQIA workers' struggle is workers' struggle. The sooner some of you all come to realize that, the sooner we can rise up together and overthrow this capitalism bullshit for good. Now let's do better. It is this approach that embraces the value of recognition. Contrastivism allows us to simultaneously recognize distinct issues that affect different identity groups, whilst illuminating the shared issues that intersect among those identity groups, namely class. Furthermore, it allows for a degree of understanding for someone to focus on issues specific to their own oppression, whilst being conscious of the oppression that coexists with other groups. This can also be applied within class analysis. A person who has a desk job and a person who does manual labor can simultaneously become class conscious and recognize each other as workers, whilst also recognizing that the degree and nature of exploitation can be distinct based on the work that they do. IP's relation to class and other identities is no different. We can embrace the shared experience of exploitation as workers, whilst recognize the nuanced differences based on other aspects of our identity. Returning to IP's origins through the CRC, this approach more closely embodies their approach to IP than it is commonly understood today. It allows for groups to focus on their own oppression and disadvantage, whilst maintaining a core focus of Marxist analysis. This is since it does not replace Marxism, but expands upon it. Furthermore, its intersectional nature highlights where disadvantages are shared and where they are not. Like mentioned by the CRC, one can consistently be conscious of being shared disadvantage or oppression in one context, but also be conscious of being advantaged or oppressed in other contexts. This is where the CRC pointed out both sharing oppression and disadvantage with black men and experiencing oppression by black men. This is where this can be extended further, is by illuminating that black men and women can share disadvantage and oppression by belonging to the working and lower class, whilst also having black men and women sharing advantage by belonging to the upper class. As mentioned previously, the identity that is universally shared is that we are human beings. And the most significant public issue that affects all human beings is climate change. This is true regardless of gender, race, sexuality, or class, although depending on location and class, the initial impacts may affect some groups more than others. And since this interacts disproportionately with class, it can also interact disproportionately with race and gender. Therefore, this places climate change as the most significant political issue for all identity groups. It is for this reason climate change ought to be the highest priority of concern. This is due to the degree of harm and that it will negatively impact both universally as human beings and in proportion to where we are situated in our identity groups. Obviously, the negative impacts of climate change will expand beyond human beings, such as non-human animals and plant life. However, even if we focus only on human well-being, it remains a significant issue. Once these contrasts are known and illuminated, we can simultaneously acknowledge our existence as individuals and collective identity groups. It is from this that we can become conscious of the social and public issues that affect disadvantaged groups across all identities. Since this argument has a Marxist leaning, I shall paraphrase Marx himself, which was also borrowed by Sinnott-Armstrong at the end of his manifesto. Identitarians, class reductionists, and universal humanists unite. You have nothing to lose but your divisions. We have a world to win.